Welcome to this fourth in our Latin American briefing series. I'm Alan Collada, the acting director of the Center for Latin American Studies. I did want to mention that although this is the last briefing of this quarter, we'll have several more, of course, coming throughout the course of the academic year. But for those of you who did not have the opportunity to see some of the other three Latin American briefing series of this quarter, you can still do that by going to our website. And there we have the video of all of our briefings, and that website is clas.uchicago.edu. That's our website. And there you can also register to receive our emails and other information of the activities of the Center for Latin American Studies. And we'll have a series of other extraordinary briefings coming up in both in the winter and in the spring quarter. I'd also like to mention that we'll have a series of other lectures and public events coming up, and that, again, you can see by accessing our website and seeing what activities we have. Today I'm delighted to be able to introduce not our speaker, Professor Sebastian Edwards, but our visiting Tinker professor first, who will do the honors of introducing our speaker for our fourth in this series on entitled Left Behind, Latin America and the False Promise of Populism. Let me introduce Gerardo Esquivel first, though. He is professor of economics at the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City, of course, and he is currently our Tinker visiting professor here with us for the entire year. He is appointed at the Harris School of Public Policy, as many of you probably know, where he taught economic policy and political economy in Mexico this quarter, and will be teaching the empirics of economic growth next quarter. Apart from his academic activities, he has also been a consultant for the International Monetary Fund, the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the Central Bank of Mexico. He's also been consultant for the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Economy in Mexico, and he was economic advisor for Mexico City Secretary of Finance between 2004 and 2005. Professor Esquivel has written extensively on economic issues, and he has received numerous distinctions for his academic research, among which he was awarded the 2005 National Prize for Research that is given annually by the Mexican Academy of Sciences for the most outstanding scholar in the social sciences in Mexico under 40 years of age. So with that, I would invite Professor Esquivel here to introduce our speaker today, this evening.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Mr. Colata. Thanks you all for being here. I have the honor to introduce Sebastian Edwards to this for this talk. Sebastian Edwards is the Henry Ford II Professor of International Business Economics at the Anderson Graduate School of Management at the University of California in LA, where he has been since 1981. He earned his first degrees at the Catholic University of Chile, as both as an engineer as an economist, and then he came to the US to earn a master's and a PhD degree at no other place but at the University of Chicago, which was almost 30 years ago he got his PhD. And he was, from 1993 to 1996, the chief economist of the Latin American region, for the Latin American and Caribbean region at the World Bank. And from 2001 to 2003, he also served as president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, LACEA, and he also served at some point as a member of California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger Council of Economic Advisors. Sebastian has been a very prolific author. He has written numerous articles in academic journals. The list of them is close to 20 pages, so I'm not going to mention them. Has written, edited, or co-edited about more than 25 books in the past few years. He has written very influential papers on topics such as economic openness and economic growth. Right there is where he has made very important contributions. The real exchange rate, currency crisis, macroeconomic populism, macroeconomic stabilization, etc. In addition to all of that, Sebastian is also well known for being an art lover. He's an art collector as well, of Latin American art. Has also recently made an incursion as a writer of a novel, El Misterio de las Tañas, which was also an editorial success in Chile. And was actually talking to me about that, and I think we strongly recommend you to read it. It has been a success in Chile, and you can find it in many other places. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sebastian Edwards back to the University of Chicago after all these years. Sebastian, welcome back to the university.
Thank you very much, Gerardo. Thank you very much, Gerardo. It's a great pleasure to be here. I first came to Chicago in 1977 as a PhD student. And the economics department was then in this building. And I spent probably the most interesting 4 years of my life intellectually at this university and in this building. And it's always a great pleasure to be back and to have the opportunity to talk to the faculty and to students about different things. And what I'm going to do today is talk about Latin America. And what I'd like to do is to try, I don't know if I'm going to be successful in this, but try to be brief and see if we can have a conversation. I think that conversations are usually more fruitful. I have opinions, actually have strong opinions on almost everything. So anything you want to talk about, I will have a strong opinion. Most of the time backed by the data. Sometimes not that strongly backed, but most of the time backed by the data. So what I want to talk is about Latin America and a little bit trying to place the discussion within today's economic problems of the day. And in doing so, I'm going to sort of rely on this book that just came out. It was published by the University of Chicago Press. There are copies of the book for sale on the back of the room, and if I impress you sufficiently, maybe you'd want to purchase one. And of course, I'll be delighted to sign them. But I was told by the press that I should say this. Gerardo was asking me if this was Medellin. This is actually real, the photograph. But it could be Valparaiso, it could be Barranquilla, it could be any city where there are mountains. Of course, not where there are no mountains, but anywhere there are hills, it could be, and it's actually real. So what I suggest that I do is the following. First, I'm going to talk about the book very briefly, what the book says and it doesn't say. And then I'm going to talk about Latin America today. And of course, in doing that, I'm going to base the discussion mostly on the kind of, on the material that is in the book, although I get out of it because I'm going to try to put things into an even more recent perspective. So I have 5 points here, and these are 5 points that I make in the book. But as I was walking from the business school across the street, I thought that there were other 5 points that I wanted to start the discussion with. And those are sort of 5 attributes, 5 characteristics of Latin America that people have in mind, that these people from certain generation, I can see there are lots of undergraduate students here, but people from certain generation, when they think about Latin America, immediately 5 things more or less come to mind. And the first one is dictatorships. Okay, it's very recent that we have the whole region, or most of the region, under democratic rule. And right now, one way or another, we have every country in the region under democratic rule, with the exception of Cuba. Second, recurrent crises, one crisis after the other. And the joke was, of course, that you could not talk about the Mexican crisis without saying which one, because every 6 years there was a major crisis. And we haven't seen a Mexican crisis for quite some time. The most recent one, and I talk about the Mexican crisis and other crises in the book, is the Argentine crisis, which is one of the most devastating economic crises ever in the history of humanity. And in the book, I call it the mother of all crises. So dictatorships, crisis, galloping inflation. The average inflation in the 1980s in Latin America was like 1,000%. Now, of course, it was distorted by a couple of countries that had 5,000% inflation. You cannot imagine what that kind of yearly inflation is, but that's what Argentina had during hyperinflation. Brazil didn't quite get to that, but was very close to that. So let me see if I have my 5 points. Dictatorships, crisis, galloping inflation, incredibly skewed income distribution. When Gini coefficients, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and most of you probably know, Gini coefficients are measures that we use to record and to try to understand the distribution of income, and they go from 0 to 1. 0 is perfect equality, 1 is perfect inequality. And the first time a Latin American country was analyzed and we got data for the Gini for Colombia, people thought that it was a mistake. They could not think that Ginis could be that high. And then they did Brazil, and Brazil was much higher than Colombia. So very, very, very skewed income distribution. And finally, corruption. So these are the 5 points. If you think about Latin America, or if you are someone that is, 40 years old, and someone says Latin America, and you go through a Rorschach psychological test, tell me 5 things that you can think about. Don't be shy. There are seats here. 5 points about Latin America. Then people would say, well, dictatorships, crisis, inflation, awfully uneven income distribution, and corruption. And then, of course, you would add wonderful poets, Pablo Neruda, exquisite novelists, and we just had the most recent Nobel Prize winner, Mario Vargas Llosa. By the way, his most recent novel that came out 2 weeks ago is quite interesting. It's a Peruvian writing about Africa. It happens, most of it in Africa. Well, about 1/2 of it happens in Africa. But this is what is that. And the point that I want to make is that today, dictatorship doesn't apply any longer. All of the region, with the exception of Cuba, is under democratic rule, one way or another. And any attempt at changing that is received in an awful way. Even Honduras now has had elections. And Ecuador, there was an attempt at a coup a couple of weeks ago, and most of the presidents traveled to Quito to support later President Correa. There have been no crisis, and I'm going to start my other part of the discussion with that. Inflation is contained. Income distribution continues to be very uneven, but there is generalized recognition that that is a very serious problem. And corruption is still a very serious problem, although probably less so than what it used to be. So the main point that I want to make is that out of 5 attributes, today 3 don't apply any longer. So we are in the face of a changing Latin America, and that's very important. Now, the main points that I make, the title of the book is Left Behind. And of course, I'm trying to be playful there, and it's a linguistic game, if you want. And it refers to 2 things. It refers to the fact that Latin America has been left behind historically from an economic point of view. And I'll explain, I think, what I mean by that. And there is what I mean by that. And also it refers to the left in Latin America being a little bit out of date. And I'm going to talk about 2 different lefts, and although I'm being a little bit unfair by saying that, because there is a left in Latin America that is very much at the very center of things. And Lula and Dilma in Brazil are, of course, the most visible, but not the only representatives of that left. So I start at saying the 5 points that I make in the book. First is that Latin American historical underperformance, and I'm going to explain that underperformance in a second, is due to a combination of institutional and economic factors. And in particular, I point out that inadequate economic policies, in particular protectionism, was at the center of Latin America's underperformance. The Washington Consensus reforms that were enacted in the 1990s, I argue, were aborted halfway. And the reason why they're aborted halfway was that is related to my third point, was because there were major currency crises, of which the Mexican crisis of 94 and the Argentine crisis of 2001 are the most important representatives, but there are many more, including the Brazilian crisis of 1998, the Uruguayan crisis of 2002, the Ecuadorian crisis, and you go, almost every country has major currency crisis where the value of foreign currency just jumped through the roof. And the greatest example, of course, is Argentina, where for 10 years the value of the dollar was 1 peso, and then it wasn't. And when it stopped to be 1 peso, $1, very quickly it moved to 4 pesos, $1. And then you can imagine that the middle class that had been saving money to buy a car or to send kids to school or to pay for the daughter's violin lessons or whatever it was, all of a sudden in hard currency, their savings went to 25% of what they used to be. And they lost their jobs. So it was a tremendous crisis. And the Washington Consensus, the globalization, the free market were blamed for this crisis. And thus, there was a rejection of free markets and so on, and that resulted in the resurgence of populism. I make the point also that there has been tremendous progress on macroeconomic policy. I'll talk about that in greater detail. And the final point is that it is unlikely that the future will belong to Latin America. And the reason why I say that is that there is a great enthusiasm. There's been great enthusiasm in the last few years about Latin America. The Economist, which is that a magazine that many people read and get fascinated by, and is so well written. In general, if you read The Economist long enough, you realize that historically it has had two objectives. One is to bash the US, and the other one is to bash Latin America. And all of a sudden, they continue to bash the US and say the awful things about the United States. But Latin America has, although in the latest issue there's an article that is quite skeptical about Brazil, which I agree with, as you will see, but they even put the statue of Christ from Rio as a rocket taking off on one of their covers recently, implying that now Latin America is going to go forward and it's going to do very, very well. And I'm going to be skeptical about that proposition. I'm going to argue, and I argue in the book, that Latin America, it's much more likely to be a three-speed continent going forward, with one group that is going to look less and less like Latin America in the future, another group that will be like Latin America has been historically. That is, it's going to muddle through. It's not going to be terribly. It's not going to do terribly well, but it's not going to do awfully. And then a third group that is going to continue to lag behind. Okay. So let me just give a few some data, and then I'm going to move into my discussion of the current situation in the world and how I see Latin America behaving and acting there. This is what I mean by Latin America having been left behind. So economic historians have tried to reconstruct data on well-being and on standards of living. And what they've concluded is that in 1500, which is when the Europeans arrived into the Americas, the indigenous people in what today is Peru and Bolivia had a higher standard of living than the indigenous people in the plains of North America. Okay? So South America was doing better before the Europeans came, better than North America. By 1700, if you want to think in modern terms, income per capita or GDP per capita was roughly the same in both parts of the world. By 1820 is important because it's when many Latin American countries finally get independence. Okay, so the independence movement starts in 1810 with the invasion of Spain by Napoleon. Then they become independent for a few years. Then the Spanish go to the reconquest of Latin America, and then there is more independent struggle, and finally around 1820, 1818, 1820, it varies from country to country, final independence is achieved. And by then, Latin American income per capita, and here I'm using data that compares the 13 original colonies in North America to the 13 largest countries in Latin America. And the largest countries include Cuba at that time, and important, and then it's dropped from the sun. By 1870, it's 50%, and you can see the data. So this is real, and now it's picked up a little. Okay? So now it would be like 21%. Okay? So we've gone from equality to 21%, and if you look at other indicators, you see the same kind of lagging behind. Yes?
How do they weigh for the fact that so many people in 1700 and still a lot of people now are living subsistently?
Well, they get a very low number in these data. So you could have some kind of weighing system where if you live below poverty, you're really doing particularly badly, and then you attach a higher weight, and it could be a weighted average. In which case, Latin America would do even worse than it does today, because as more and more countries, and I show that in the book, as more and more people in North America get out of poverty, many people stay poor in Latin America. But basically what I want to tell you is that being left behind, it's not only sort of a sort of anecdotal type of thing. There are data that give you sort of the numbers of what it means being left behind. Another thing that it's interesting that I discuss in the book that I just want to mention in passing is the relationship between Latin America and the United States. And I have here a number of highlights, including the Monroe Doctrine from 1983, and also the intellectual way in which Latin Americans relate to the U.S. And loving to hate the U.S., of course, is something that is very Latin American, especially among intellectuals. And Enrique Krause from Mexico has written quite extensively on this. And he argues that it's only the upper middle class in Mexico in particular that hate the U.S. because the lower classes love the U.S. and in fact they vote with their feet and they move into the U.S. But what I argue there and I go through Rubén Darío, José Enrique Rodós Ariel from 1900 is a wonderful book to read if you haven't read it yet, and so on and so forth. So this is something that I think is interesting. Then I tried to look at institutions. One of the explanations why Latin America was left behind is that they developed the wrong type of institutions. And then people sort of compare Alexis de Tocqueville with Sarmiento's book, Facundo, which is what I have here, and how Sarmiento argues for the type of institutions that de Tocqueville is actually celebrating in the U.S., but never Latin America gets those kinds of institutions. And then there is a question, why was that the case? I mean, why was it that in Massachusetts, certain institutions decentralized with the people actually electing their own township authorities and local judges, and the schooling system being decentralized was so different in Latin America? And there are a number of theories, and the one that I discuss quite a bit in detail in the book is a theory by the Australian-Chilean sociologist Claudio Vélez, where he uses Sir Isaiah Berlin's hedgehog and the fox discussion to argue that the Spanish during the colonial times were like Berlin's hedgehog. They were good at one thing, and they emphasized one thing, and they built institutions that would further that one thing, while the English were like Sir Isaiah's fox, and they were good at many things, and they were very curious. And being good at many things helped leverage and propel all the inventions from the Industrial Revolution and make them into productive, massive, good-producing mechanisms that greatly helped the industrialization of the United States. Interestingly, Rodó, if you haven't read him, in his 1900 book, deplores the fact that the Americans are so vulgar, that they invent these things, they discover all these scientific advances, and then they want to apply them to everyday's life rather than just for the sake of learning. So what Vélez says is that we have the foxes, and the Industrial Revolution needs foxes. And the Spanish are like the hedgehog. And the one thing that obsesses them is maintaining the Catholic faith alive. And the Counter-Reformation is the one event that marks the institutions that are created in Latin America. And that the combination of Philip II and his government and his successor and the Catholic Church create these incredibly centralized institutions that have as their ultimate objective to protect the Catholic Church from the Protestants. And the Counter-Reformation is the one event that marks Latin America, and every institution is created around the principles of the Counter-Reformation. And I discuss this, and I discuss other theories. So these are the kind of things that the book has, and I'm going to skip this because I want to get into this. So let me get into three big points and quickly, and they are the following. The first one is the current crisis in Latin America, and looking at this from the perspective of what I discuss in the book. Second one, current dangers and concerns in Latin America. And finally, what should we think about the future? And I know that my good friend Henrique Meirelles, the governor of the Central Bank of Brazil, was here last week. I don't know how many of you attended his lecture, but probably some of the things that I say are going to be in contradiction to what Enrique said. Of course, he cannot be as candid as he maybe wanted to be because he's a very senior government official. So let me talk about the global financial crisis in Latin America. This has to do with one of the attributes about the region that I mentioned before. This is the first time in decades, or maybe in a century, where the word crisis is not automatically associated to Latin America. Okay? And that is remarkable. And now when we talk about crisis, we really talk about the pigs. And the pigs, there are two versions of the pigs country. The pigs are Portugal. The one version has one eye, and the other version has two eyes. And I like the two eyes versions, and my Italian friends hate me for that. But that's that. So the pigs are Portugal, Ireland, maybe Italy, Greece, and Spain. Okay? And these are the countries that are now going through a crisis. And this crisis is reflected by the fact that it's becoming increasingly expensive for these countries to access the international capital markets, to borrow in order to pay for their expenses. And this is the cost of borrowing, and you can see for the pigs how it went through the roof. And this is these are data until about 2 months ago. And if I were to show you data till yesterday, Ireland will be up here, okay, with Greece. And historically, when a big crisis happened somewhere else, like the Asian crisis in '97 or any crisis anywhere in the world, Latin America would react going through its own crisis. There would be sort of a mirror type of reflecting Latin America. And Latin America, if we had asked a mechanical computer to say, to tell us what would have been the reaction of most Latin American countries to the PIGS crisis or the subprime crisis, they would have said Latin America would have gone through a balance of payment crisis, currency values would have collapsed, inflation would have gone through the roof, there would have been a significant hike in unemployment, and there would be very, very major significant political instability. And almost none of this happened. Okay? And here you can see the cost of borrowing in the Latin American countries. And you can see that it spiked up after Lehman Brothers, but then it came down. And in fact, it is today lower than in the European periphery. This is my favorite slide. Some of you know, some of you don't. I was born in Chile. And this is the Spain-Chile soccer game in the World Cup. And the Spanish won, and the Chileans were eliminated. And then the Spanish went to win the cup and became world champions. And there's something called transitivity that I'm sure you learned in grade school. So if you lose to the champions, that means that you are like second best. But that's a different discussion. So the same day Chile was losing to Spain, that same day, in the World Cup, in another competition, which is the global financial markets competition, Chile was beating Spain handsomely. And this is the cost of borrowing internationally. And Chile is, of course, is supposed to be a poor Latin American country. And the cost of borrowing internationally in Chile at that particular day was 152 basis points. That's 1.5 percentage points higher than the cost of borrowing in the US. Okay? However, the Spanish, if they wanted to borrow, they had to pay 2.2 percentage points higher than Germany. And Germany and the US is more or less the same. Okay? So Chile was considered by the financial market to be a stronger credit subject, a more credit-worthy country than Spain, and that continues to be the case until today. And this reflects in a significant way the fact that in Latin America, there have been no crisis, which is absolutely remarkable and very, very unique from a historical point of view. And this has been the result of major reforms in what we economists call macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic institutions. And basically what Latin America does is that it has now market-determined exchange rate values. So the currency is allowed to move up the value or down depending on market forces. In the past, we had fixed exchange rates where the authorities tried to defend a certain value of the currency. And of course, that defense became implausible at some time, and then we had a crisis. But now we don't have that, so we have market-determined exchange rate currency values. International reserves were built up to protect these countries, and many countries have now sovereign funds where they set aside some income when the price of their exports go up in order to have some money in the piggy bank to spend when hard times come around. They can borrow international. Central banks are now very professional, very well run. You saw the president of the Central Bank, the Central Bank of Brazil last week, a highly professional former commercial banker and very, very serious, and reasonable fiscal policy. Okay? And I'll talk a little bit more about these. These are public debt ratios. This is total debt to GDP. It's a ratio. And these are for advanced countries. And you can see that almost every Latin American country, even, or in particular Venezuela, everywhere has a lower debt to GDP than the UK, France, Germany, and the USA. Most Latin American countries today would meet the criterion to join the Eurozone, while most countries, or every country that is a member of the Eurozone and that uses the euro as its currency, would not qualify today. Now, I don't know if the Latin American countries would want to join the Eurozone, but they could, according to the Maastricht Treaty's criteria. These are international reserves. I don't want to go into the details. Let me just tell you that this shows that every country, even Costa Rica, that has very little reserves, has more than enough reserves according to international criteria. These are, again, the cost of borrowing for many countries, and we can see that Portugal and Greece, and now, excuse me, if I added Ireland, exceed Latin America. And this picture that I'm giving you is the result, as I said earlier, of these amazingly important macroeconomic reforms. And I've done some technical work with mathematical models and all the things that economists do when they do academic research. And what I've done with these models is simulated what would have been the income per capita of a typical Latin American country that has recurrent crises, and the income per capita of a Latin American country that would just sail without a crisis. It's not like a spectacular country. It's just everything else is the same except that there are no big crises. And after one generation, the crisis country would have the typical country. A typical Latin American country is something like a combination between Mexico and Argentina, something like, right? That's a typical country. And a typical Latin American country would have had 20% lower income per capita after one generation. So we should not underestimate the impact and the importance of these macroeconomic reforms and this fact that now pretty much Latin America until now, whether this will continue in the future is a different question, but until now Latin America has been in the last 8 years or so free of crisis. Now, the problem, of course, is that macroeconomic stability is not enough. And if you really want to reduce poverty, reduce indigency, reduce the number of people that live under a certain level of well-being, then you need much more than macroeconomic stability. And that's going to be the subject of my third point. So before getting there, let me talk about three concerns that I have about Latin America, and I talk about these in the book at some length. The first one is that in almost every country, Argentina being sort of the only exception, currency values have gone up very significantly. And I don't know if Enrique talked about this about Brazil last week, but you can see that the currency value in Brazil has just shot through the roof. Very, very strong currency value. Very strong increase in the currency value in Chile, Colombia, Mexico less so, but it's coming up, and in Peru. Okay? And the increase in the currency values means that when these are called real exchange rates. So we're measuring here the currency value relative to the cost of living in the country. So one way to think about this is that as the cost of living stays constant, the number of pesos that exporters get per dollar that they export goes down. Okay? So you need fewer and fewer pesos to buy a dollar. If you need fewer pesos to buy a dollar, that means that the peso is stronger. Right? So if you get fewer pesos per dollar that you export and the cost of living is the same, exporters are losing competitiveness, are being less able to export. Another way to think about this is that the number of pesos per dollar that you get remains the same, but the cost of living goes up. Okay? So the exporter gets the same number of pesos per dollar, but it has to pay more and more for labor, for rent, for insurance, for energy, electricity price. So either way, it's bad for exporters. And this is something that is affecting every Latin American country. And it has a number of causes behind it. One is that the terms of trade, that is the price of Latin American exports, has gone through the roof. Commodity prices have increased very dramatically. The second one is that Latin America has become very fashionable and lots of dollars are going into Latin America. So if there is an overabundance of dollars, the price of the dollar falls. Fewer pesos per dollar, and that is what is generating this. Let me see, there's a question. No, okay. So the problem with this is that this is a recurrent problem in Latin America. It's called currency overvaluation. And it has been behind many of the crises. And some of us are beginning to worry that there may be something going on, that this cannot go on forever. Okay? So we've seen these movies before. Okay? Previous versions with Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart. Now it's Russell Crowe and Julia Roberts or whoever. But the movie is the same. Now it has better color and all that, and the other ones were black and white. But we know how they end. Right? Strengthening. These are the Mexican crisis, right? These are the crises. And we see this is Colombian. So we're worried that there may be a crisis because currencies are strengthening remarkably. And the authorities in the countries are beginning to worry. The people, in particular exporters, because they're getting fewer pesos per dollar exported, are beginning to complain. And central banks are being forced to intervene. And there is a whole discussion on what to do about this. And the problem is that this time around, usually, let me back up for a second. Usually, what has been behind this kind of phenomenon in Latin America are policy mistakes in Latin America. So let me go back to the example that I gave that is the easiest way to illustrate. This can happen if the number of pesos you get per dollar exported stays constant, like it did in Argentina, for 10 years, 1 peso per dollar exported, but the cost of doing business goes up. And so you have to pay more for labor, more for input, more for insurance, more for rent. So you're being priced out of competition. Now, if these prices are going up, local prices, while this peso per dollar is constant, there is something wrong that the country is doing. But now it's very different because Latin America has been caught in these global currency wars. And these global currency wars have at the center the value of the yuan, the Chinese currency, and the discussion on what is going to happen to the dollar. And what is happening is that the yuan is not losing value relative to the dollar because it's not strengthening relative to the dollar. So the US currency has to weaken globally. It has not weakened relative to its second most important trading partner, which is China. So that means that it has to weaken relative to other countries. And if the dollar weakens, the other currencies strengthen, and this is the phenomenon that we were seeing earlier. And now Latin America is suffering this collateral damage from these currency wars. And it's very little that Latin America itself can do about it. And the discussion then is what's going to happen going forward. And I think that probably we're going to see a number of things that are not particularly good. And the most likely situation is that the dollar will continue to weaken. And the reason for that is that the Federal Reserve will continue to pump money. Okay? So most of you are not economists and are not doing economics, but this is a graph of the amount of liquidity that the Federal Reserve has pumped into the system. Okay? And when we teach economics to our undergrad students or to our MBAs, one of the things that we explain to them is that if the central bank prints too much money, there's going to be inflation. Okay? And when I've been teaching for a long, long time, every time I say, imagine that the Federal Reserve, and then the students sort of blank out. So you have to give the Federal Reserve some figure. Say, imagine that Alan Greenspan, so the students now can relate to Alan Greenspan, doubles the amount of liquidity overnight. And immediately the American students sort of roll their eyes and say, the professor is completely out of his mind. How can he imagine that a serious institution like the Federal Reserve will double the quantity of money overnight? Right? Well, here you have it. It doubled the quantity of money overnight. And it became a banana republic central bank. Right? And now we have this new thing called QE2. And QE2 does not stand for the Queen Elizabeth II. It stands for quantitative easing II, where the Federal Reserve is going to further increase the amount of dollars. And that will probably, or the market thinks, is going to weaken the dollar. And if the dollar weakens relative to all other currencies strengthen relative to the dollar, including the Latin American currency. And we have seen currency wars in the past, and those currency wars can be very costly. Some of the big currency wars that we've seen in the past happened, one into the interwar period, another one immediately after during the Vietnam War that resulted in the end of the Bretton Woods system. And a key question then is what's going to happen to the dollar? The French talked in the 1960s and early 70s about the U.S. exorbitant privilege. This is President de Gaulle. He used to be the president of France, a general. Now he's an airport, pretty much. And this is his prime minister and his successor, President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. And we don't know yet, still we don't know who coined the term exorbitant privilege. But it refers to the fact that the U.S. can print international money. And it's a privilege because, of course, if you go to Bolivia, the Bolivians would love to print money that everyone accepts, but if you go with Bolivian pesos, or Bolivianos, I forget what they have now, if you go and you try to buy something in the Frankfurt airport, people will look at it and say, this is monopoly money. They won't accept it. But if you try to pay with dollars, people in Frankfurt or in Tel Aviv or in Dar es Salaam or in Kuala Lumpur will accept dollars. That's an exorbitant privilege that the Americans have in the past and apparently will in the future, as we saw in the quantitative easing, abused. And if they abuse it, the dollar will collapse, and if the dollar collapses, as I said, all other currencies are going to go up, including the Latin American currencies, and that is something that is creating a lot of problems. And if the dollar goes this way, it's a big question of what's going to happen to the rest of the world. And one of the problems is that, of course, there's going to be an attempt at preventing currencies from strengthening in Latin America too strongly. And it was the Brazilian Minister of Finance, Guido Mantega, that said that referred to currency wars recently, and he said we are going to fight them, and we're going to fight the strength of our currency because the U.S. and some people have even suggested that the U.S. deliberately is trying to weaken the dollar in order to encourage exports and create more jobs. Obama said he was going to double the number of export-related jobs in his administration, his first administration. Right? So how do you double the number of jobs related to exports? Well, you have to export more. How do you export more? Well, you have to convince more people to export. And one way of doing that is that if you get more dollars per euro exported, or more dollars per yen exported, and you get more dollars per yen exported if you depreciate your currency. So Latin America is caught, one big concern, caught in these currency wars, currency strengthening, and this is going to likely result in central banks intervening. The central banks intervening means that they will have to buy dollars because the dollar is losing value, so someone has to buy them in order to prop the value up. If they buy dollars by printing pesos. Now, there are too many pesos in the market. The central bank has to sort of wipe them out. How do they do it? They do it by something that economists call sterilization, which is they try to sell bonds, but that brings interest rates up. So it's a big mess that is going to result in a lot of upheaval and instability. So that's one concern. Second concern is populism, and I'm going to sort of skip through it because there may be a lot of questions. But there is an issue of trying to take shortcuts. And one of the things that populists do is try to take shortcuts, and they base the political discourse on a true fact, which is that Latin America has an awful income distribution and significant corruption. Remember my 5 original points? I said 2 are still true: awful income distribution and a lot of corruption. Those are facts, and the question is how to deal with them. And what populists do is that they try to take shortcuts, and they try to deal with these hard facts of life, and of course very undesirable features of Latin America, by implementing the type of policies that are good for the short run, but are unsustainable in the longer run and create deep crisis. And what we are seeing now in Venezuela is a significant and recurrent crisis where there are shortages, black markets, lack of water. There's been a drought, of course, but also blackouts and a number of problems that have been the result of an attempt to take these shortcuts. And the problem is not that, it's not the diagnosis. The diagnosis is correct. There's a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, and a lot of corruption. The question is how to deal with it. And as I said, the populist governments usually try to take shortcuts that imply in implementing extremely expansive fiscal policy. This is going to sound like the US now, okay? So you have economic problems, lots of people are out of work, and there's an income distribution that has been worsening, and then you deal with it by having very, very expansive fiscal policy and very, very expansive monetary policy, and that may create an alleviation of the problems in the short run, but will create a crisis in the long run. Right? We don't know if there's been a crisis in the US. And here are some of the better known representatives of what we call, and the book I have 2 chapters or 3 chapters on populism, and I compare traditional populism to what I call neopopulism. I discuss in great detail a very interesting feature of recent populist experiences, which is neopopulism constitutionalism, and how new constitutions have been written in a number of Latin American countries. These are the constitutions that have allowed Hugo Chavez to stay in power since 1998, and probably is going to stay in power for some, although in the latest elections for Congress, his party didn't do too well. But these are the constitutions, new constitutions that have allowed Evo and Rafael Correa and Hugo, and the Nicaraguans are now trying to get moving in that direction to be elected in almost forever. And what is interesting, and I discuss in the book, is that there is a whole intellectual movement about these constitutions. And they are very different from the U.S. Constitution. They are deliberately so. They move deliberately away from the U.S. Model. These are very long constitutions instead of being very short documents. They are not protective constitutions. They are not aimed at protecting individual rights of people. They are what are called ambitional constitutions. They are not supposed to last very longly, for a very long period of time. They're supposed to last for no more than 10 years. They are not. It's not supposed to be hard to change them. Here in the U.S., it's very, very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment. In Venezuela, it's very easy. In Ecuador, it's very easy. So it's a completely different doctrine, and I discuss that in the book, and I think it's quite interesting. And my third concern has to do with narcotics and the collapse of the institution of the state in some countries. I will not get into this, but I think that you cannot talk today about Latin America without referring to this narcotic traffic and what is going on in some countries. And let me go to the last part of my talk. I think that we're going to end it at time. And this is, what about the long run? So what I've said is that in the short run, the world is in crisis, and Latin America has done quite well. For the first time, no Latin country is in deep trouble. There are, however, 3 issues that concern me. One is that purely economic, that currencies are strengthening, and when when prices go up too quickly, there's a reason to become suspicious, unless you are absolutely 100%, and here we are at the University of Chicago, believer 100% in free market, that free markets are always right. But when the price of real estate goes up by too much, then you should start asking yourself, well, maybe it's a bubble. Right? And I remember a conversation I had in 2006 in Tokyo with a good friend, a professor at the Trinity College in Dublin, and he was saying how difficult it was for them to hire new faculty. And I said, why? You have a great department and big intellectual capital, and it should be very interesting to be there. Well, he said, well, housing has become very expensive. And I said, what do you mean by very expensive? Well, a small terraced house, that's a row house, in Dublin cost 1.5 million euros. This was a few years back. And I've been to Dublin. And I said, well, what neighborhood? And he named, and I said, this is impossible. I mean, there's a bubble in Ireland. And he said, if people pay for those prices, then it's not a bubble. That's a market price. Right? The problem is that sometimes there are bubbles. And the concern then about the currency is if they go too high, they may fall. And when they fall, we may have a crisis. So let me just summarize again. Latin America is doing very well at the current time. When there's a world crisis, no crisis in Latin America. Every country is growing. And there's been no inflation outburst and no balance of payment or currency collapses, and that's a result of wonderful macroeconomic policy. However, there are 3 things that concern me. Currency values increasing too quickly, that will result in central banks doing things, capital controls being imposed, all sorts of possible problems. Second concern has to do with, third concern was drugs, and what was the second concern? Populism, of course, the subject of the whole book. And now let's talk about the long run. So are we moving towards a Latin American decade. And what I have here is, this is the famous, I don't know how many of you are in economics, this is the famous Goldman Sachs paper. And this is where the acronym BRICS was coined. Okay, this was published in 2003, and it was published by Goldman Sachs. And they coined the acronym BRICS, which is the most brilliant thing that they did. If you read the paper, it's pretty pedestrian. And BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Okay? And what Goldman was asking is, what's going to be income per capita in these countries in 2050? And they showed that, given a certain number of assumptions, these countries were going to grow at such a rate that they were going to surpass the Western powers at some point. Most of them are going to surpass the Western powers, most Western powers, before 2050. But basically what this paper is that it tells you in a very simple way what is required to grow in the long run. And it's a very simple thing, and it has an equation. And I love this paper because as soon as I give this paper to my MBA students at UCLA, two things happen that are related. First, they stop hating equations. Since they all want to work for Goldman Sachs, as soon as I give them this paper, they say, oh, equations are not that bad after all. And related to that, then they start demanding equations. If I teach a whole lecture without an equation, at the end, 2 or 3 will come to me and say, Professor, where was today's equation? And what this equation says is something very simple. And it says that in order to grow, a country needs more capital, including infrastructure. It needs more and better labor force. And it needs to combine capital and labor in an ever more efficient way. And that's called productivity. And what I'm going to argue is that on these 3 areas, capital accumulation, skills accumulation, and productivity, Latin America in general does particularly badly. And specifically Brazil does poorly. And Brazil is supposed to be the star of Latin America going forward. Okay? So let me start by infrastructure. And infrastructure is one form of capital. And one of the important roles of infrastructure is to deal with distance. And my colleague Ed Leamer at UCLA has done a lot of work on the role of distance in international trade. And he has shown that being, of course, this is obvious, being far away from where the marketplace is bad for you. But not only that, he has quantified this, and he has concluded that 2,000 kilometers distance is equivalent to your product being subject to an import tariff at destination. Okay? And the one thing that I show you here is that Latin America is much, much farther away. This, of course, we all knew, but I give you the numbers, from Lisbon. And why Lisbon? And I'm comparing distance to Frankfurt, which is sort of the center of the European market. And I could do it to Chicago or any place, and the results would be very similar. And the problem, of course, is that, or the reason why I have Lisbon, is that many Latin American countries until recently, until the PIGS crisis, had been arguing, many politicians, we want to reach Portugal's level of income by a certain date. Okay? Why Portugal? Well, Portugal was sort of the lowest income advanced country. So it was a way of saying we want to become, or we promise you that the country will be an advanced country by 2020 or whatever. Okay? But if you want to be and compete with the Portuguese, and you want to sell the Germans something that the Portuguese are selling them, you have to be able to place your product in Lisbon at the same price as the Portuguese product. Because otherwise, if you place it at a higher price, then they're going to buy the Portuguese product and not your good. Okay? And you have to travel this additional distance. And the only way to deal with this is if you have much, much better infrastructure than Portugal. And infrastructure is a very important component of capital. And you can see that the average cost of exporting a container in Latin America is about $1,200. And in Portugal, it's about $750. In Finland, which is one of the best, is $620. So and it has to do with infrastructure, with red tape, with unions at imports, and so on and so forth. And unless we improve this, let me just go through this, and I'll then. This is highways. And this, again, is a ranking. And you can see that the best-ranked Latin American country is Chile, 22nd. But Chile is so far from everywhere that if it really wants to compete with the Portugals of the world, it should have highways that are the second or third best in the world. This is the only way that you can sort of try to defeat the curse of geography. I mean, if you are far, how can you get closer? Okay? So one way of getting closer is that if you really have such an incredible infrastructure, so much better than others, that it's easy to get where you want to go, even though it's farther away. And there are other data here about infrastructure that show you how bad it is. In order to invest capital accumulation, you need to save. Latin America saves very little. Okay? Latin America saves on average and invests on average 21% of its product. India invests 42% of its product, so it's twice as much. And China, 45% of its product. So capital accumulation, including infrastructure, we do quite poorly. Productivity has to do with red tape, the ability to create new businesses, to innovate, to have new ideas incorporated into the system, and so on. And the World Bank has looked at these doing business data, and there's a ranking on how easy it is, and many of you have seen it, how easy it is to do business and create new firms, and how the innovation capacity of countries. And Latin American countries, again, do very poorly. And what I want to show you is, in particular, Brazil. And Brazil is ranked 129th out of 180 countries. Okay? So if you, and the kind of questions that are asked in this doing business, I don't know if you have seen it, so they have 11 different indicators, and they ask how many days does it take in terms of the actual work and the permits and the red tape and all of that to get a container of export, the goods that you want to export, onto a ship. Right? And the best country in Latin America is Panama, as I showed you. The second best is Chile. And in Chile, I just checked the new data that came out last week from the World Bank. It takes 21 days. So from the time you bring your products to the port, to Valparaiso, say, to the time that those goods are in the container and on the ship, it takes 21 days. In between the different shifts that the workers, the way they work, the role of unions, that they cannot work overtime and this and that, red tape and so on. In the advanced commodity exporters, it takes 7 days. So it's 1/3. Okay? So if you are far away and it takes 3 times longer to actually put the goods on the ship, you're not doing very well. Okay? And this is the kind of things that doing business does. And as you can see, Latin American countries are not doing very well. The best placed country is Mexico, on this 35th position, 35. And Argentina is 129, Venezuela 145. These are the best 4. And not only they're doing well, and they are improving, which is quite good. Although Peru jumping 20 positions in 1 year, it's a little bit suspicious. I mean, if you go to Peru and you ask people that managers of companies, what did Peru do in the last year that justifies 20? The only thing they can think about is that Peru did not qualify for the World Cup. So instead of watching all the games, they were working hard. And maybe that explains, but 20 positions is a little bit too much. So anyway, but these are the data that we have. And the third point that I want to make, well, one point that I want to make is that and I make in the book very, very strongly, is that Latin America is subject to this what I call regional comparison syndrome. And when these data came out, these are new data from last week. Okay, so last week, every newspaper in Mexico had a major headline: Mexico best in Latin America. Right? And every headline in newspaper in Chile said, Chile improves once again in the World Bank ranking. And the Peruvians say, we jumped 20 positions. So, and we are second best in Latin America. But the most important thing is that they keep comparing their performance to the rest of Latin America. Anyone from Argentina here? Anyone from Chile here? Yeah, okay. So Chile's obsession since times past is to beat Argentina. Right? So every time, basically, when you read in the news, Chile it's the least corrupt country in Latin America. Basically, what it says is least corrupt than Argentina. And it's an obsession, cultural obsession, historical obsession, and it really reflects the inability that Chile has had at beating Argentina in soccer. But beating Argentina in economics, it's become easy. It happens every day, unfortunately, for Argentina. And what I argue is that Latin America, it's very important to change the benchmark. And that really what Latin America ought to do is to start thinking about successful, small, nice, friendly. By friendly, I mean countries that don't invade other countries just for the sake of it. Commodity exporting countries. And when you do that, you cannot be satisfied by being in the 35th position if Australia and New Zealand are in the 9th and 3rd place in these same rankings. Okay? And I argue that by comparing yourself with your country with your own region, you are destined at, if the region is lagging behind, staying behind. And I want to sort of end with this. This is the PISA test. So I told you that the Goldman Sachs, and why I use the Goldman Sachs paper, I didn't have to because the Breaks is very famous and Goldman Sachs is a good name. Most people now hate Goldman Sachs. I think it's undeserved. But anyway, in order to grow, you need more machines and better infrastructure, more and better skilled workers, and more efficient way of combining machines and workers. That's called productivity. And productivity is affected by institutions and policies, including red tape and regulations and so on. We saw that regulations, institutions, and policies keep Latin American countries behind in terms of how easy it is to start a business, how easy it is to innovate, and so on and so forth. We saw that infrastructure is pretty bad. They don't save enough in order to create more, to accumulate more capital. And finally, skills. This is the PISA test, which was taken last time. 4 weeks from today, we're going to have new results. Okay, these are results from 3 years, that were released 2 years ago and referred to 4 years ago. These are the latest. Okay? And I know that you cannot read the names of the countries. And it's deliberate. I don't want you to read the names of the countries. I want you to listen to what I'm saying. Okay? So this is the best performing country, and this is the worst performing country. Okay? And the median is here. The median divides the sample into two groups. The median is exactly where it ought to be, where the United States is. Okay? So the quality, these are standardized tests for sciences that are given to 8th graders, okay, so 13-year-olds. Okay? So the U.S. public schools, they're mostly public schools. There are 5,000 kids in every country that have that take this test the same day, same questions. Okay? And the U.S. is right here. Okay? And this is the Slovak Republic. Okay? So the U.S. is followed by the Slovak Republic. Where is Latin America? Here. Okay?
Norway is there too?
Pardon me?
Norway?
No, Norway is around here.
I don't know.
We'll see.
I think it's there.
Oh, Norway is here. Yeah. Finland is here. Finland is the best, always. Okay? So, Chile is here. And Brazil is here. Okay? This should be moved a little. Okay? So Brazil is here. And Brazil is 53rd out of 57 countries. Okay? And I of course love Brazil. I'll talk a little bit more about Brazil in a second. I have a chapter in the book where I compare Lula to Chavez, and Lula, of course, comes out wonderfully. And I think that but the point that I'm trying to make is that the future, in terms of economics, cannot belong to a region where you educate your kids at this level, where and where there's no capital accumulation, where institutions are weak, where corruption continues to be high, where income distribution continues to be this is the Gini coefficient. Latin American countries will have Gini's around here, around 0.6. It's very, very high, and income distribution is very... So there is a question of whether really Latin America is going to become the region of the future. And my answer to that is that it's unlikely, although we cannot rule it out. And what is more likely is that what we're going to see is a 3-speed Latin America going forward, with one small group of countries performing very well, shining and becoming bright stars, and moving farther and farther away from the mean, Latin American mean, and resembling more and more the successful commodity exporting countries. And another group that is going to lag behind, and that those are going to be countries that are going to run into successive crises, mostly because of this attempt at taking shortcuts, populist attempts at taking shortcuts. Shortcuts never pay. Okay? And as I said in the book, I have a long discussion on what I call the populist cycles and so on and so forth. And what that illustrates is a very important point, which is that the left in Latin America can be extremely successful. And the reason why Chile has done very well, mostly is because the left has been able to pursue policies for the last 20 years that are pro-globalization, pro-stability, pro-growth, and at the same time have been able to deal in a fairly successful way with social inequality and social problems. And poverty has been reduced in Chile from 30% of the population to around 13% of the population. Now, whether this new right-wing, more conservative government is going to be able to continue this trend, that's still to be seen. But the left, in particular President Lagos and President Bachelet, have been remarkably successful. And they are not the only ones. President Tabaré Vázquez in Uruguay has been very successful. His successor, President Mujica, who was a guerrilla leader for the Tupamaros, is also very serious, very pro-globalization, pro-stability, and is going to do very well. And Lula is, of course, the better-known, although I don't think the most successful, but the better-known leader from the left that has moved Latin America in the right direction. The countries that are going to stay behind, as I said, are going to be those that are probably Venezuela, Nicaragua, Ecuador, I'm not so sure. And then the question, the rest of the countries are going to be in the middle. And the key question is where the three big ones are going to be: Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And I think that there is a true possibility that Brazil will move into the higher group, but they will have to go through a significant revolution. This enthusiasm about Brazil that you're seeing today really is not warranted if you look at the hard data in terms of the quality of their infrastructure, the quality of their education, the ease to start new businesses, the quality of their university system. If you look at everything that Brazil can offer, there's basically two things that it can offer. And they are both sort of not that important for the long run. One is that it's a huge country. Second, it is a country that has finally defeated inflation. Both of those things are very important. Well, and third, the commodity prices are up, but that I don't think it's going to continue. Those are two important things, but now they need to really tackle the structural impediments to long-term growth. And I think that Dilma, although the press has said that she's much to the left, much more to the left than Lula, and she doesn't have a vision for reform, I think that she's going to, it's likely that she's going to do it. And I think that if that happens, Brazil will move to the first group. Mexico, I am skeptical. Probably, in my view, will stay in the second group. It has a great advantage, which is location. Right? And as they say in California, everything is location, 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 location. And Porfirio Díaz said, pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. So far from God and so close to the United States, poor Mexico. And he got it wrong, right? And the point is that it's actually a blessing to be close to the markets. And Argentina, which is the country that I love the most, probably even more than the country where I was born, and has the most wonderful people. Unfortunately, it has the most awful politicians. So I'm not sure where Argentina is going to be. I hope that it doesn't fall into the third group, but there is a probability. So let me stop here, and if you have any questions, we can deal with them now. We started a little late, so I think we can run for a few more minutes. Thank you very much. Yes?
I first had a very small, thank you very much for coming to speak. I first had a very small question. You said it's about $1,200 to export a container from the middle of Latin America. What's the comparison for like China?
I think it's like 900, but I would have to check. But again, the thing about China, that's a very interesting question, because should we compare ourselves to China? Right? And the problem is that China has this advantage that Latin America does not have and will never have, which is its labor is very, very inexpensive. So the cost of labor in Brazil is like 3 times that of China. Right? Now, Brazil and China, in terms of doing business, are used to be classified around the same. China is improving very rapidly. But if you don't have a very inexpensive labor, you have to have other things that compensate it. And that is a problem. Yeah. You. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think that the Fed might take some exception with your term.
A banana rip.
Well, a currency war. I mean, much of the Fed action has been, due to high unemployment. It has been due to there being virtually no inflation. And so I guess my first question would be, would Latin American countries prefer their biggest export market to suddenly collapse and have no import capacity? The other thing is, we were talking about comparing Latin America to Portugal. I don't know the numbers, but I'm thinking that Latin America has a lot of unique products that can be, and I'm speaking most specifically of commodities, that a place like Portugal doesn't have and will never have. And as long as the world economy continues to grow, developing countries continue to expand, their products, copper, raw materials, metals, they're going to be needed in high demand. And I think that's an advantage that Latin America has that other areas don't. And the only last thing I was going to say is, you mentioned some small, nice countries that didn't take part in invasions. Some of the first Special Forces troops in Iraq.
War for Australia. Yeah, I know. So let me. All points are well taken. So let me do the Portugal one first, because that's the easiest one. I don't want to compare Latin America to Portugal. That's what politicians have been doing for a long time. And what they've been promising in Latin America, they've been promising is that we're going to reach developed status by, it used to be by 2010, by the bicentennial, which is this year. And of course, 2010 came, and it's about to go, and they haven't reached developed status. So now it's 2020, the true bicentennial, 2018. Now, when they are asked, and President Lagos and many of them have, what do you mean by reaching developed status? And the answer is, we want to be like Portugal. Now, I agree with you. That's why my comparison is New Zealand and Australia, exactly for the reason that you gave, which are commodity exporting countries. Now, the Latin American countries would like the Chinese. So if you talk to May Reyes, who was here last week, or to De Gregorio, or to the new president of the Central Bank of Mexico, or to Agustin Carstens, who was also an alumnus of this university, and he's now the Secretary of the Treasury in Mexico, they say, what we would like to see is that the Chinese allow the yuan to strengthen. So then the U.S. the dollar will weaken relative to the yuan. There will be no need for the dollar to weaken against other currencies. So they are now joining the U.S. in trying to persuade the Chinese. Now, we know what the Chinese are going to do. They either are going to smile and do nothing, or they are not going to smile and do nothing. But they are not going to change their policy with respect to the yuan. That we know is going to happen. Now, once that's not going to happen, what should the Latin Americans do? One possibility is do nothing, like the main character it says in the T.S. Eliot's play, The Cocktail Party, do nothing. Probably is the best thing to do. But unfortunately, what they're going to do is that they're going to impose capital controls. And Colombia already has done it. Chile is thinking about doing it. Argentina has done it. And Brazil has done it. And imposing capital controls is not per se bad. I've written a lot of papers where I show that they have some positive effects on some of the variables. But they, of course, breed corruption and generate a lot of other problems. And, of course, the Fed is going to take exception to whatever I said about the Banana Republic or weakening the dollar. In fact, Tim Geithner was very upset at Alan Greenspan, because Greenspan suggested that the Treasury, who is responsible for currency policy in the U.S., was trying to weaken the dollar. So I agree with you. Yeah.
In the Economist article that was in September, where it had Latin America upside down.
That, by the way, comes from a Uruguayan artist, Joaquin Torres Garcia, and his group of art. That was their logo, the Joaquin Torres Garcia group, and Gerardo was mentioning the work I've done on Latin American art. So it comes all the way back from 1919. It's a beautiful figure. Yeah.
But my question is, they talked a lot in that article about the stabilization in the region and how it's helping them get more trade partners, and they talked a lot about Colombia. And so I'm just wondering, because you brought up the drug trade, like they said more and more people are investing in Colombia, but from what I understand in classes and stuff, the drug trade is not slowing down in any way. So I'm just wondering for Colombia and Mexico, how you think that is going to affect all of this.
Well, yeah, the reason why Colombia has become a more attractive destination for investment is basically because the guerrilla, the FARC are losing ground, and the security and situation has improved. Now, there are lots of problems that we know about, and there are accusations, and they are being investigated, some not enough, about violation of human rights and so on. But the drug trafficking in Colombia has been reduced somewhat. Not significantly or not as much, but it has been reduced somewhat.
I thought it was just decreased from the FARC and the drug trading.
Well, it's it's because it's illegal. It's hard to know by how much. But most people that I've talked to suggest that it has declined somewhat, and in particular, distribution channels through the Caribbean part of Colombia in speedboats have been disrupted by the Coast Guard. And that, of course, if you try to put it down here, it comes out here, and here is mostly in Mexico. And I think that is it will continue to be a problem. And the solution, of course, is in part, as I argue in the book, in the final consumer countries, and that is mostly the U.S. And I don't think that we're going to do anything about our drug policy in this country. California voted against legalizing marijuana 2 weeks ago. And as they say, where California goes, the rest of the nation goes. So if California said no, and the Mexicans are seriously talking about the only solution to this problem is legalizing marijuana. And their argument is that, and I don't know if this is true, but the serious argument is that the total drug trade in Mexico represents $24 billion, of which $12 billion are provided by marijuana, which is the easy stuff. So that covers the fixed costs. And all the hard drugs, heroin, cocaine, and all the rest, are margin. And if you disrupt, according to the youth, you disrupt marijuana, then what's going to happen is that they're going to run into deep trouble, and that's our way. So, but of course, here in this country, we're never going to go for that, and that's going to create a problem. Yeah.
You started the lecture saying that the only country with dictatorship right now is Cuba. However, in Venezuela, we saw the president change the constitution so he could be reelected forever. The president of the Congress and the president of the Supreme Court, they say openly that they do what the presidents tell them to do. And also recently, last week, the head of the Venezuelan army openly said that he will not recognize the results in 2012 from election for president if the opposition wins to Chavez. So would you say that those three elements that really crossed the line? So
yeah, I'm quite sympathetic to what you're saying. If you read the book, I'm not a fan of Chavez, but there were elections. 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, Chavez allegedly, in terms of popular vote, lost narrowly, but lost. The opposition is back in the game. They have now about what is it, 1/3 or between 25% and 1/3 of Congress. So, yeah, 40% of Congress. So, given the way the system is set up, even though they got a majority or half of the vote, they didn't get half of the seats. Yeah, I mean, I think it's borderline, and we're going to see what happens going forward. What I find interesting is that all of this is in the Constitution, and the Constitution now can be is easy to amend. And now, what will happen going forward? If the Venezuelan army does not recognize and if the opposition wins in 2012, then of course we're going to move Venezuela to the dictatorship column. But right now, I think it's sort of borderline. And you could put, I would not strongly oppose the view that it is on the other side slightly. Okay? But of course, it's far, far, far from Cuba. And I think that is okay. And far, far, far from the right-wing dictatorships of the 1970s and the rest of Latin America. Are there any other questions? Any thoughts? Comments? Well, thank you very much for coming.